Since 1972, the Housing Executive have admitted that the rubbish disposal units in the flats are obsolete and overloaded. This problem creates vermin. This is borne out by the fact that even the bin men have to burn the rubbish in the bins before they empty them to kill the rats. Since the Housing Executive became aware that we were making this programme, a massive clean-up operation by them has taken place. The residents of the complex called it the Big Clean-up. Housing Executive cleaners out in force, removing lorry loads of rubbish, attempted to stay ahead of the cameras, but fortunately for us, they were not always successful. And if the Housing Executive imagine that they could clean up 6 years' neglect in 3 weeks, they must be at least twice as daft as we are portraying them. There are only 3 passenger lifts and 1 goods lift in operation in the complex. The lift doors have been known to open when the lift is not there. This happened recently, resulting in a young girl falling and crushing her pelvis.
6 years ago, during civil disturbance, these 2 particular lifts, which are passenger lifts, were put out of action. They have been boarded up ever since. Replacement lifts have been lying in a store not 30 yards from here for the past 18 months and rusting up.
One of the most horrifying things about living in these flats is the problems that occur during a funeral. Recently we had a bereavement in our house, and rather than bring the coffin up in the lift and round all the narrow accesses like this, we decided to bring the coffin up the stairs, 6 flights of stairs, and into the house. The same problems occurred in reverse at the time for burial, where we had to bring the coffin up this narrow pathway, down 6 flights of stairs and into the hearse. It seems that even in death, the planners can steal away our dignity.
The feeling of isolation is overwhelming. People trapped in their cells. The deck access like a catwalk in prison. But, unlike prison, the wall toppings are not a form of communication. In fact, the planners have managed to make people feel isolated and, at the same time, have taken away their privacy.
This cell is cold and damp and small. I've counted bricks on every wall. The cracks and cobwebs I know so well. The disgusting food and terrible smell will never leave my memory. To be jailed in one place for 4 long years, to have screamed and cried and shed all tears, to be left on my own like a rabid beast, has changed my outlook on life at least. I'll never laugh again.
I'm a doctor in the Lower Falls area here, and as such I have occasion to visit the Divis flats virtually daily. First of all, the flats themselves, they were thrown up some years ago. There was a considerable housing shortage in this area. The flats were really built in a very short space of time, and unfortunately there was no foresight shown at all in any proper planning of these buildings. But as a doctor, what I have noticed here was that you really have thousands of people living virtually on top of each other. And you have over families living too many people in each flat for a start, but above all you have the flats so terribly close together. You've got dampness in the walls, mustiness in ceilings, and the amount of anxiety and neurosis and depression that not only myself but many of my colleagues see virtually daily is really quite significant. First of all, the young mothers with families, we find that depression and anxiety are very, very common features here. Now, admittedly, in this area there's been a lot of civil strife. One can't blame the flats for that, but at the same time, in an area with such civil strife, it is no help for people and families especially living in areas such as this. The great majority of these people are decent people. Many of them, a terrible number of them, are unemployed. Now, on top of all this, you have young mothers living in these flats. Their children have nowhere to play. The facilities are absolutely terrible. The older children, the teenage children, parents are worried as to where they are because they have to go out. There are no amenities within the flats themselves, so they have to go out in the evening times in an area, as I said, where you have terrible civil strife, where there's danger of assassinations, etc. For very young children, it must be quite obvious that living in an absolute concrete jungle like this, it is difficult for young children to have anywhere to play. They're in the way of adults. You've just this little paths up and down along the flats themselves. Mothers who are depressed and suffering from chronic anxiety, many of whom are on tranquilizer drugs, they cannot give of their best to their children, even though they want to do so very much, simply because many of them are quite unwell.
Obviously, when you're depressed, what would you say was the exact cause of your depression?
These flats, Paul, insulation of them, you know, constant worry of them, you know. 9 out of every 10, my neighbours and all are the same with the depression, Paul. Everybody has the same problems, you know. Their children worrying about diamonds and the dangers are in, you know.
And what about the amenities in the complex? Is there anything for you to do to sort of lift yourself out of this?
No, Paul, there's none whatsoever. There's nothing, only the bingo, and I don't even bother the bingo, Paul. I can't sit through it.
And this is all there is for a woman of your age?
That's all there is around here, Paul. Even for the children, there's very little for the children to do here even.
Well, living in Divis to me is an enigma. That inside your flat you can do what you want, but if anybody wants to visit you, you immediately think, oh my God, you know, to come round through miles of balconies, which are always filthy, with rubbish and that, you know. So you find that you're directing your visitors to go to some of your relatives' house, rather than bring them into Divis. And it's the same when anybody asks you where you live. You know, you just say the Falls Road. You know, it's very rarely you would come out and admit that you live in the Divis flats.
After this tale of woe, the natural question is, if the flats are as bad as we have seen, why don't people move out? To answer this question, we need to look at Divis flats as being a part of a larger area, West Belfast. West Belfast is the largest ghetto in Europe, since ghettos in Europe have gone out of fashion. The area is bursting at the seams with a population of over 100,000 in an area of some 400 acres. In 1971, Belfast and its environs saw the greatest forced population migration in Western Europe since 1945. Approximately 70,000 people changed their homes in this period. The already overcrowded conditions in West Belfast were massively increased by the tremendous influx of people from these migrations. This served to create a seller's market in the private housing sector, which caused inflationary prices for substandard housing. In fact, we have Southeast England house prices on 1/2 the national average income. This is what forces people to stay in Divis flats. Some families are so desperate to get out of Divis flats that they move to houses which have had plumbing and wiring removed in preparation for demolition. Our conclusions are this. At the outset, the planners did not consider people's requirements, nor did they consider that the population would not want to live in this environment on a permanent basis. They did not consider the effect of medium to high-rise living on young children, young married couples, old-age pensioners, or indeed anyone. They isolated people, took away their dignity, forced them to live in filthy conditions. Squalor is everywhere. They replaced 1,300 houses with 1,200 flats, 40 shops of all kinds with 9 shops, 20 pubs with 1 pub, and they destroyed a community. And then, under the special circumstances in West Belfast, people are trapped. This only increases the spiral downwards. People lose faith in themselves, see no hope for the future, and these feelings are transmitted to the children. A community without the means to build roots is a community doomed to extinction. And so, what can we do to alleviate the horror and degradation of living, if it can be called that, in Divis flats? Faced with a hostile officialdom in the Northern Ireland Housing Executive and calculated neglect from the government, the situation has only worsened over the past few years. The consensus of opinion in Divis Flats is that even if the Northern Ireland Housing Executive were prepared to heat the 600 flats properly, build more play areas for the young, social clubs for the old age pensioners and adults in the flats, if they were to build more shops and pubs, if they were to paint and brighten up the area and generally make the place more livable, the people would still not be happy. One of the basic complaints is that the people do not want flats. They do not want to live like battery hens. They want houses at ground level, like normal people.
It must be obvious by now that the people do not like living in these flats, and our conclusions are these: that there are no long-term solutions to the problems that happen in these flats, and the only way that we can get out of this problem is by demolishing them. This may seem a radical step, but by no means would this be the first time this has been carried out. For example, in St. Louis, America, flats of this type have been demolished. We ask the Housing Executive now to give some consideration to our pleas and knock down these flats and build us houses.
Well now folks, before I go, take some advice and please say no. When they offer you a council flat, demand a house and stick to that. Tell them it's a house you want to live in, not a bloody lighthouse.